The year was 480 BCE. The sun rose over the rugged cliffs of central Greece, casting long shadows across a narrow coastal pass known as Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. The name came from the sulfur springs that seeped from the rocky earth. But in that moment, it might as well have referred to the fate awaiting those who stood there. On one side, an invading force the likes of which the Greek world had never seen, assembled by Xerxes I, great king of Persia. On the other, a coalition of fiercely independent city-states, with a mere 300 Spartans at the core, led by their king Leonidas. The Persian Empire, by this time, stretched from the Indus River in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west. Darius I, father of Xerxes, had tried and failed to subjugate Greece a decade earlier at Marathon. Now Xerxes sought to finish what his father had started. He amassed what ancient chroniclers claimed were over 2 million men, though modern estimates suggest closer to 100,000 to 300,000. Still, it was a force utterly unmatched in scale. Infantry from every corner of the empire had gathered, Persians in scale armor, archers from Media, axemen from Assyria, cavalry from Bactria, camel-mounted troops from Arabia, and conscripted levies from as far as Egypt and Nubia. They marched in a thunderous column, crossing the Hellespont on massive pontoon bridges built at Xerxes' command. Behind them, a fleet of hundreds of warships shadowed the coast. Against this storm stood a fraction of the Greek world. Sparta had answered the call with only 300 of its full citizens, not because they lacked warriors, but because of religious law. It was the time of the Carnia festival, and the oracle at Delphi had warned against going to war. Yet Leonidas believed delay would mean annihilation, so he chose 300 men, all with living sons, to carry on their bloodlines. They were not alone. Thespians, Thespians, and other allies brought the total Greek force at Thermopylae to about 7,000. Still, they were outnumbered by tens of thousands. Leonidas selected Thermopylae not out of desperation, but strategy. The pass was a narrow choke point between the sea and the mountains, no more than 15 meters wide at some stretches. It neutralized Persian numerical superiority. Here, their cavalry would be useless. Here, the phalanx could hold. Spartans trained from childhood to fight in formation, shield against shield, spear thrusting with mechanical precision. Their large circular shield was both armor and weapon. It created a wall of bronze and would impossible to break without enormous sacrifice. When the Persians arrived, they expected immediate surrender. Xerxes sent envoys, offering rewards for submission and annihilation for defiance. Leonidas dismissed them coldly. Herodotus claimed the Spartans laughed when told the Persian arrows would blot out the sun. "Then we shall fight in the shade," one replied. For 2 full days, wave after wave of Persian troops assaulted the Greek lines. The narrow pass allowed only a few ranks to engage at a time. The Spartans rotated fresh troops to the front. Their discipline held. Persian casualties, mounted, elite immortals, the king's personal guard, were sent in highly trained, armored in scale mail, but they too were repelled. It wasn't just Spartan strength. The Greeks had studied the terrain. They fought beneath sheer cliffs, where falling rocks could crush attackers. They lured the enemy into traps, then surged forward with brutal counterattacks. Persian morale began to crack. Xerxes grew agitated. His men died by the thousands, while the Greeks lost few. It was a humiliation, but betrayal would soon change everything. A Greek named Ephialtes, seeking reward, revealed a mountain path to the Persians, a goat trail winding behind the Greek position. Xerxes seized the opportunity. He sent a detachment under cover of night, climbing through treacherous terrain, to outflank the defenders. Greek scouts spotted them, but too late. Leonidas knew the trap had closed. At dawn on the 3rd day, Leonidas gathered his remaining men. Most of the Greek allies retreated. He ordered them to, knowing the battle was lost. But the Spartans, along with 700 Thespians and a few others, chose to remain. They would not surrender. They would not flee. They would hold the pass to the last breath. The final stand was brutal. Surrounded, with their flanks and rear exposed, the Greeks fought in a loose circle rather than a wall. They fought with broken spears, with swords, with bare hands. Leonidas fell, pierced by arrows. His men fought to recover his body. The Persians overwhelmed them, but not easily. Some Greeks, according to accounts, refused to die until the very end, clawing at their enemies with their nails when weapons failed. When it was over, the pass was filled with the bodies of the dead Persians, stacked like lumber, Greeks lying in blood-soaked dust. Xerxes ordered Leonidas' head severed and mounted on a pike, an act of rage and warning. Yet in death, Leonidas became something else, a symbol. A monument would later rise at Thermopylae, carved with words that echoed through history. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. The Persian army did not linger long at Thermopylae. Xerxes had expended far more time and men than anticipated in taking the pass, and his campaign timetable pressed forward. Yet the delay had cost him dearly, not just in soldiers, but in prestige. The psychological blow was profound. The great king, ruler of the largest empire on earth, had been halted for days by a few thousand defenders and his elite units. The Immortals had been bloodied and turned back by men wielding spears and bronze shields. His supposed invincibility had cracked. As his forces marched south into central Greece, they did so with a new sense of caution. Towns surrendered, some out of fear, some out of pragmatism. Others burned their own homes and fled into the hills. But the resistance had not ended at Thermopylae. It had only begun. While the Persian land forces advanced, their navy followed along the coast, shadowing the route toward Athens. At Artemisium, a strait just north of Euboea, the Greek fleet met the Persians in a simultaneous naval engagement. The Greeks, led by the cunning Athenian general Themistocles, held the line at sea, much like Leonidas had on land. Themistocles had not forgotten Thermopylae. He had understood the importance of that sacrifice while the Spartan stand was still ongoing. He had sent messages to the cities of central Greece, urging evacuation and resistance. His navy, composed primarily of Athenian triremes, maneuvered strategically, attacking isolated ships, using the narrow straits to nullify the Persian advantage in numbers. The sea battle raged inconclusively for days, until news of Thermopylae's fall forced the Greeks to retreat. Still, the time bought was invaluable. Athens, now exposed, made a radical decision. Rather than defend the city walls, Themistocles ordered a full evacuation. Women, children, and the elderly were ferried to the island of Salamis and the Peloponnese. Temples were emptied, statues carried away or buried. When the Persians reached Athens, they found it nearly abandoned. Those who remained fought from the Acropolis but were slaughtered or enslaved. Xerxes burned the city, including the old temple of Athenian Act, intended to demoralize the Greeks, but instead it steeled their resolve. The sacrifice of Leonidas and his men had already begun to transform the Greek psyche. It created a rallying point, a unifying legend. The Spartans had died not in vain, but with defiance that echoed across city walls and council halls. Word of their bravery spread swiftly through the scattered Greek palaeus. In the Peloponnese, new defensive walls were raised across the Isthmus of Corinth. More soldiers were mobilized. But above all, the navy, the only force capable of stopping Xerxes, was given new urgency and support. Themistocles understood what few others did, that the war would not be won on land. Even as Athens burned, the Greek fleet regrouped at Salamis. There, Themistocles played his boldest hand, knowing that Greek unity was fragile and that some city-states were already wavering. He sent a false message to Xerxes, claiming the Greek alliance was collapsing and that the fleet was planning to retreat. It was a trap. Xerxes, eager to crush the Greek fleet and end the campaign, took the bait. He ordered his navy into the narrow straits of Salamis, where their numbers became a liability. Greek triremes, lighter and more maneuverable, rammed and sank ship after ship. The Persian fleet was shattered. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne on a hill above the battle, saw his naval power disintegrate. Panic spread. He feared being trapped in Greece, though his land army remained formidable. Without naval support, it was vulnerable to encirclement and supply disruption. Xerxes returned to Asia with the bulk of his forces, leaving a general named Mardonius in command to continue the campaign, but the tide had turned. The myth of Persian invincibility had drowned in the waters off Salamis. Leonidas' stand had not just delayed Xerxes, it had inspired a strategic realignment, shifting the war from desperation to counterattack. Greek alliances solidified. Even rivals like Athens and Sparta found cause to fight side by side. A year later, at Plataea, Greek hoplites led by the Spartans would crush the remaining Persian forces on land. On the same day, the Greek navy would destroy the remnants of the Persian fleet at Mycale. The invasion was over, But in the years that followed, the memory of Thermopylae grew larger than any battlefield. It became legend, not just in Sparta, but throughout the Hellenic world. In Sparta itself, the names of the 300 were recited as a roll of honor. Statues of Leonidas were erected. His sacrifice became the standard by which future generations of Spartans measured themselves. Boys in the Agoge Sparta's brutal training system were taught not only how to fight but how to die. Come back with your shield, mothers told their sons, or on it. It was not metaphor, it was cultural doctrine, and it was contagious. Across Greece, playwrights composed tragedies invoking the Spartan last stand. Orators referenced it in speeches urging courage against tyrants. Even enemies of Sparta grudgingly admitted the nobility of the act. Thermopylae became more than a military delay, it became a moral act, a symbol of duty, of choosing to fight not because one expects victory, but because surrender is unacceptable. It was etched into the Greek conception of honor, and into the foundational memory of what it meant to be free. In the decades after Thermopylae, the name of Leonidas became a whisper that lingered in marble courtyards and echoed through the narrow streets of polis and port. His stand had not just inspired a military resurgence, but ignited a fire in the collective memory of the Greek world, a permanent reference point for courage, obedience to law, and sacrifice without reward. Sparta, already known for its militarism and stoic discipline, now had a martyr whose death transcended the battlefield. The image of 300 men resisting an empire was not allowed to fade. It was cultivated, taught, passed from father to son, carved into monuments, spoken in rites of passage. Back in Sparta, the dead were honored not just with statues, but with song and law. It became custom that a man who fell in battle for Sparta's defense was remembered above all others. But the Thermopylae dead were unique. They were not just mourned, they were institutionalized. Their stand was woven into the framework of Spartan ideology. The ethos, the 5 magistrates who oversaw daily governance, invoked Thermopylae in judicial oaths. New recruits in the Agoge swore to uphold the virtue shown at the hot gates. The death of Leonidas, who had defied both the oracle and Persian might, was seen not as failure, but as moral victory. The battlefield itself, Thermopylae, became sacred ground. Travelers came to see the site where the narrow cliffs met the sea, where Persian bones had mixed with Greek dust. The stone lion raised in Leonidas' honor loomed over the plain, and a simple stone inscription bore the famed words that all who passed would read. Commemorations were held annually. They were not grand affairs. Spartan tradition despised excessive mourning, but they were solemn, revered. Young Spartans were brought there to listen to the tales, to understand what was expected of them should Sparta call. Elsewhere, in Greece, the story traveled with sailors and merchants. Athens, newly risen as a naval power, began to craft a different narrative from Sparta's. Their victory at Salamis became the center of their pride, and their temples displayed it. Yet even in the heart of democratic Athens, the memory of Thermopylae lingered. Aeschylus, the tragedian who had fought at Marathon, wrote lines that evoked the Spartan resistance. Philosophers pondered the meaning of duty in the face of certain death. Thermopylae became a canvas onto which Greek thinkers projected their understanding of freedom, fate, and the individual's role in service to the state. As the generations turned, the nature of Greek warfare shifted. Hoplite tactics evolved, alliances shifted, and internecine conflicts began to eclipse the memory of unity. The Peloponnesian War, decades of brutal conflict between Sparta and Athens, saw Greeks killing Greeks, and the cohesion of the Hellenic world crumbled. Yet even during these bitter years, the ghost of Thermopylae remained present. Spartan generals invoked it before campaigns. Athenian leaders, even while opposing Sparta, reminded their people that the Persians had once been the common enemy, held back by a sacrifice no city-state could afford to belittle. After Sparta's eventual triumph in the Peloponnesian War, their dominance became both a blessing and a curse. Lacking the administrative sophistication of the Athenian bureaucracy, Sparta found itself ill-equipped to manage a wider empire. Resentment grew among its allies and subjects. But whenever criticism swelled, whenever someone questioned whether Sparta had earned its place at the top, Spartan statesmen answered not with words, but with memory. Thermopylae was their proof. They had bled for Greece when others hesitated. They had stood, immovable, while the world watched. It was an unanswerable argument, yet time, inexorable and indifferent, dulls even the sharpest sword. By the 4th century BCE, a new threat loomed on Persian, but internal. Thebes rose in power. Athens regained strength. The idea of a unified Greece became more fantasy than goal. Still, even as the Peleus fractured, the imagery of the 300 Spartans remained a shared touchstone. It was invoked in political discourse, in battlefield orations, in the teachings of Plato and the rhetoric of Demosthenes. Even outside Greece, the legend began to grow. Persian chroniclers mentioned the stubborn resistance at the pass. Egyptian scribes, influenced by Persian rule, recounted tales of Greek defiance. Thermopylae passed from history into myth, yet still rooted in fact, still anchored by that core reality. A narrow road, a wall of shields, and the will to resist overwhelming force without hesitation. Children in Sparta continued to recite the names of the fallen. In temples, offerings were made not to gods alone, but to the memory of Leonidas and his men. And every year, when the heat of summer dried the earth at Thermopylae and the sulfur springs steamed under the weight of the sun, men came to stand where the phalanx once held. They walked where blood had soaked the ground. They remembered, but memory alone could not stop the coming of Macedon. Alexander the Great would one day pass Thermopylae on his march to conquer the very empire that once tried to crush Greece. When he did, he stopped. He ordered offerings to be made at the tomb of Leonidas, and then he moved on not to resist the Persians, but to take their throne. Thermopylae had shown what men could do with death in their hands. Now, Alexander would show what could be done with ambition. Still, he bowed to the legend. Even an emperor in the making had to kneel where 300 men had made history. By the time Alexander knelt at Thermopylae in 336 BCE, the soil that had once drunk the blood of Spartans was now part of a land unified in name, but fractured in soul. Sparta still stood, proud and rigid, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of Greece. Its armies were feared, but its influence waned. Yet the memory of Thermopylae remained unblemished. Even Macedonian kings, backed by cavalry instead of hoplites, bowed before it. Leonidas had become more than a man. He was a standard by which rulers measured legitimacy. The figure one honored before daring to carry Greek arms into Asia. Alexander understood this well. Before he marched east to shatter the Persian Empire, he made his pilgrimage. It wasn't ceremonial, it was strategic. He knew the symbolism. He knew that if he wished to present himself not merely as a Macedonian king, but as the avenger of Greece, he needed to tie himself to that ancient stand. He needed Thermopylae, so he offered rites, made sacrifices, and praised the 300 not as soldiers of Sparta, but as guardians of Hellas. That reverence was echoed by his troops. Many came from Thessaly, Boeotia, even Athens. Most were not Spartan, and yet all were taught the story. They carried it with them as they marched through Asia Minor, as they faced the same enemy their ancestors had resisted. When they stood across the battlefield from Darius III's Persian legions, more than a century had passed since Thermopylae, but in their minds the Persian was still the ancient foe, and they were still inheritors of Leonidas' legacy. As Alexander pushed further through Syria, into Mesopotamia, down to the Persian capital of Persepolis, he carried the idea of Greek superiority, forged not just by conquest, but by endurance. In the burning of Persepolis, many saw a symbolic vengeance for the sack of Athens, for the deaths at Thermopylae. Alexander let his men plunder the Persian palaces, torch their halls. It was not strategy, it was message. The Persians had once burned the temples of the Acropolis, now their own sacred halls were ash. The ghost of Leonidas, unavenged for generations, was finally at rest. But empires are short-lived. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire fractured. His generals tore at the carcass of conquest like wolves, and in the chaos that followed, Greece fell further into decline. Sparta remained stubbornly independent for a time, refusing to join leagues or submit to Macedonian overlords. But its isolation became weakness. While other cities adapted, Sparta clung to old codes. The rigid militarism that had once produced heroes now produced stagnation. The population of full citizens spartiates declined, wealth concentrated in fewer hands. Discipline eroded, yet the memory of Thermopylae endured, even as Sparta itself faded. In the Roman era, the legend was reborn. Roman historians, fascinated by the discipline of the Lacedaemonians, preserved the tale. Leonidas was held up as the ideal of Roman virtue, courage, sacrifice, fidelity to law. When Roman senators debated what it meant to die with honor, they cited Thermopylae. The example crossed cultures. Roman emperors toured Greece and paid homage at the pass. Statues were restored, inscriptions were refreshed, even the layout of the battlefield was preserved. Though the sea had receded and the cliffs now stood further from the road, Spartan boys no longer trained as they once had. The agoge became more ritual than function. But Roman elites sent their sons to Sparta to learn Laconian virtues, not for war, but for character. A legend had outlived the world that birthed it. The story became curriculum. Leonidas was no longer a king. He was a mirror held up to all men who wielded power. The hot gates, once a defensive position, became a pilgrimage site for generals, senators, and scholars. Thermopylae was now a lesson, a warning, a vision. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, new values competed with the martial ideal of the Spartan dead. But even as the faith of the people changed, the reverence for Thermopylae did not vanish. Early Christian thinkers, especially in the Eastern Roman world, adopted Leonidas not as a pagan king, but as a symbol of martyrdom. He was framed as a man who died not for glory, but for a cause larger than life, a theme that resonated in the new religious paradigm. His death was now paralleled with the sacrifices of saints, of men and women who refused to renounce their beliefs before worldly power. The Byzantines inherited this layered legacy. In Constantinople, copies of Herodotus' histories were preserved, recopied, and passed down. Thermopylae was part of their cultural memory, a defining moment of the old world that still held lessons for the new. When Byzantine emperors faced Eastern invaders, whether Arab, Turk, or Persian, they too saw themselves as defenders of a gate, protectors of civilization against barbarism. Thermopylae was no longer about Spartans or Persians. It was about the line, what it meant to draw one, and what it meant to hold it. Even centuries later, when the West rediscovered classical knowledge during the Renaissance, Thermopylae resurfaced. Scholars in Florence and Paris read the old accounts and found inspiration. The valor of Leonidas was now held alongside Caesar and Cicero. Artists painted the last stand. Writers invoked it in political treatises. For early modern republicans and revolutionaries, Thermopylae became an ideal not of kingship, but of principled resistance. The 300 became icons, not of monarchy, but of the citizen soldier, and still, the mountain pass remained. Wind swept through the narrow valley. Sulphur springs bubbled quietly. No fortress stood there. No city rose, but every footstep echoed with memory. Thermopylae had not been a turning point in a war. It had been something rarer, a moment when death achieved more than life, a moment when men, bound by duty and law, faced annihilation and stood anyway. That resonance was eternal. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, religions transformed the hearts of millions, but the stones at Thermopylae never forgot. By the time the Ottoman Turks cast their gaze westward in the 14th and 15th centuries, Thermopylae had become more than a historical memory, had become a strategic ghost, a symbol embedded in the collective imagination of a continent that feared being swallowed by the East once again. As Byzantine walls crumbled and the empire shrank, the echoes of the hot gates took on renewed urgency. European chroniclers began to invoke the story of Leonidas, not merely in books, but in sermons, speeches, and royal courts. Thermopylae was no longer just a Greek memory, was now a European one. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the shock reverberated through Christendom. The last remnant of the Roman world, protector of orthodoxy, had collapsed under Ottoman cannons. But even as the Red Crescent replaced the double-headed eagle, Western Europe reached for ancient symbols to rally morale. Thermopylae rose again. Artists painted Leonidas, not in the image of a hoplite, but as a Christian knight. Writers, especially in Italy and France, drew direct parallels between the Persian invasion of Greece and the Islamic advance into Europe. Thermopylae became part of the ideological arsenal in the defense of what was now called Christendom. In 1529, and again in 1683, when Ottoman armies laid siege to Vienna, pamphleteers across Europe framed the conflict through the lens of the ancient stand. They warned of a new Xerxes, now wearing a turban, and called upon Christian rulers to be the new Leonidas. The defenders of Vienna were praised in the same breath as the 300 Spartans. Though the geography had changed, the symbolism endured. Thermopylae was not about East or West, it was about the moral clarity of resistance against overwhelming force. its meaning adapted to the needs of the time. Meanwhile, in Greece itself, the land that had birthed the legend fell under foreign dominion. The Ottomans ruled for centuries, yet even in subjugation, the memory of Thermopylae persisted. It was whispered in taverns, murmured in the hills by shepherds, taught to children not as academic history, but as inheritance. In the Mani Peninsula, where Spartans had once trained, families told the story as though it had happened within living memory. Local poets, often illiterate, recited verses about Leonidas, casting him not as a distant figure, but as an ancestor. Thermopylae became an act of remembrance, as much as resistance, tethered to a time when Greeks were not ruled, but stood free. When the Greek War of Independence erupted in 1821, the name of Leonidas was invoked from the outset. Revolutionary leaders compared their own struggle to that of the 300. Flags were carried bearing images of the hoplite shield. Fighters were nicknamed after the ancient king. One of the war's most famous martyrs, Athanasios Diakos, chose to die rather than convert or surrender when captured by Ottoman forces. Before his execution, he reportedly said, "I was born a Greek, I shall die a Greek," a sentiment that Greeks across the land connected instantly to the ethos of Thermopylae. The parallel was deliberate. Diakos was skewered and roasted alive. Execution both grotesque and symbolic. He died in agony, like the Spartans, and became a modern mirror of their sacrifice. European Philhellenes, foreign admirers of Greek culture, flooded the country, inspired by ancient legends. Men like Lord Byron did not come merely to fight tyranny, but to join what they saw as a continuation of the same story. To them, the Greek insurgents were not just rebels, they were the inheritors of Leonidas' mantle. The mountains of central Greece were again soaked in blood, and Thermopylae, both the place and the idea, hovered over every skirmish. After independence, the new Greek state formally embraced the legend. Monuments were restored. The battlefield at Thermopylae was marked and protected. School children were taught the story not as history, but as national DNA. The name of Leonidas was etched into public squares, into coins, into the names of military units. Thermopylae was more than past, it was identity. Even in the 20th century, when new threats arose, it retained its moral force. During World War II, as Nazi forces advanced into Greece in April 1941, a series of defensive positions were established in the same narrow pass where Leonidas once fought. British and Australian soldiers, fighting alongside Greeks, tried to delay the German advance. Though mechanized warfare had long made terrain less decisive, the symbolism was too strong to ignore. Officers on both sides knew the story. When the defense at Thermopylae collapsed under aerial bombardment, German commanders reportedly acknowledged the bravery of the resistance, just as Xerxes' scribes had noted the defiance of the Spartans. Once again, a hopeless stand in that narrow corridor bought time for others to regroup, to escape, to live. In the post-war years, as Greece struggled with civil conflict and then dictatorship, Thermopylae was a rallying point in both political and cultural discourse. For some, it symbolized resistance to fascism. For others, it evoked order and discipline. For all, it remained an eternal yardstick for bravery. Military academies taught it not for tactics, but for spirit. The battlefield itself became a pilgrimage, site visited not just by scholars, but by ordinary citizens who wished to walk where giants had died. The landscape had changed. The sea had receded miles away. The pass was no longer narrow, but the idea of Thermopylae remained unmoved. Annual reenactments were held. Memorials were renovated. Tourists came from all nations, and at the foot of the hill where Leonidas had fallen, a newer statue stood modern, defiant, gazing toward the horizon. It was not a relic, it was a sentinel. Thermopylae had transcended history. It was no longer an event. It was a question asked across time. When the choice comes, submission or sacrifice, what will you do? That question passed from warrior to citizen, from nation to individual. It did not require spears or armor. It required conviction, and though centuries had buried the men who first made that choice, their answer remained, carved not only in stone, but in the memory of a world still struggling with power, fear, and freedom. Into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the legend of Thermopylae underwent yet another transformation. The story, long anchored in Greek soil and European consciousness, now crossed fully into the realm of global culture. No longer confined to textbooks or national history, It became part of the mythos of Western identity. Political movements, military institutions, educators, artists, and filmmakers turned once more to the hot gates, not just as a historical episode, but as a distilled expression of human resistance, duty, and the brutal cost of principle. The Cold War era saw the revival of ancient allegories. In a world divided between two superpowers, both sides leaned on history to define themselves. The West, especially in America, began to absorb Thermopylae into its ideological narrative. The stand of the 300 Spartans was recast in populace's imagination as the ultimate metaphor for the struggle between freedom and tyranny. In speeches by presidents, in military academies, and in ideological treatises, Leonidas' defiance was used. To frame global conflict, he became a shorthand for values perceived to be under threat: discipline, courage, self-sacrifice, and the refusal to yield before overwhelming odds. Hollywood soon followed. Though the 1962 film The 300 Spartans was a modest production, it planted a seed. It portrayed the Persians as an invading despotism and the Spartans as the torchbearers of democratic ideals. Though Sparta itself had never been democratic, historical nuance was sacrificed, but the impact was immense. American audiences, living in the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis and nuclear dread, saw themselves in the surrounded Spartans. Thermopylae entered pop culture not as an ancient battle, but as a template for the modern world. But it was the turn of the millennium that brought a renewed explosion of interest. Frank Miller's graphic novel 300, published in 1998, reimagined the stand with visual hyperbole and mythic grandeur. It took liberties recasting Spartans as almost superhuman warriors, grotesquely stylizing the Persian enemy, and pushing historical accuracy aside, but it succeeded in making the Thermopylae narrative visceral and immediate for a new generation. When the film adaptation of 300 was released in 2006, it reached millions. Box office success turned the ancient story into a cultural juggernaut. Quotes from the movie entered the lexicon. "This is Sparta" became both a meme and a rallying cry. Gym-goers, soldiers, gamers, and ordinary people alike adopted the imagery and language of the film. The results were mixed. On one hand, interest in ancient history surged. Students enrolled in classical studies. Documentaries were made. Museum attendance increased. On the other, the legend was further removed from its factual roots. The complexity of the Persian Empire, the alliances of Greek city-states, the geopolitical nuances all was submerged beneath stylized violence and Hollywood drama. Yet even in distortion, something fundamental endured: the respect for sacrifice, the awe of men who chose death over dishonor, and the power of a story that transcends centuries. In Greece itself, the renewed global attention brought both pride and frustration. Historians pushed back against simplifications. Educators emphasized the differences between myth and history. Yet the Greek government also embraced the moment. Thermopylae, already a national site of memory, was promoted as a cornerstone of cultural heritage. New visitors arrived. Guided tours were expanded. International delegations were brought to the battlefield, not only to learn about ancient war, but to witness a living symbol of endurance. Meanwhile, in military academies around the world, Thermopylae retained its special place. Officers in Sandhurst, West Point, and St. Cyr studied the terrain, the tactics, the leadership decisions made in that narrow pass. But more than that, they studied the moral weight of Leonidas' choice. He had not stayed because he thought he could win. He had stayed because law demanded it, because his oath to Sparta required it, and because his death might serve a greater victory than his. Survival, that principle, the deliberate embrace of sacrifice, remained a rare and essential lesson in a world often focused on victory at all costs. Outside the military sphere, Thermopylae's story began to appear in unexpected places. Protesters in modern revolutions invoked it. Placards in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring bore the Spartan shield. During the 2014 Ukrainian Euromaidan movement, graffiti of Leonidas appeared in Kyiv. His figure was recast, not as a Greek, but as a universal defender of liberty against authoritarianism. The message was clear: Thermopylae belonged not to one people, but to all who chose resistance over capitulation. In Israel, the IDF invoked the stand in officer training, comparing Masada and Thermopylae as parallel examples of last stands. In Japan, where Bushido and martial sacrifice had their own deep roots, historians examine Thermopylae in the context of samurai ethics. In South Korea, parallels were drawn between the 300 Spartans and outnumbered units in the Korean War, particularly at battles like the Nekdong Line. Across the globe, the story traveled, adapted, reinterpreted. Yet in all of this, one thing never changed. The physical site remained. Thermopylae itself, now flanked by a modern highway and industrial growth, continued to hold its place in the landscape and the mind. Archaeologists worked to preserve what remained of the ancient road. Excavations revealed bones, armor fragments, and arrowheads still embedded in the soil. A visitor today can still stand at the hillock where the last Spartans died, where Leonidas was surrounded, and where ancient blood once darkened the stone. Each year, new names are added to memorial walls near the site. Veterans, donors, scholars, who contribute to the preservation of the story. Thermopylae has become not a static monument, but a living dialogue. Schools from across the world send delegations. Pilgrims arrive, not in sandals, but in buses and walking shoes. And though the hot springs still bubble and the cliffs still loom, it is not the geography that commands silence, it is the weight of what happened there. The Spartans are long dead, their weapons have rusted, their bones are dust, but their decision, forged in law and blood, still lives. Thermopylae is not remembered because they won, it is remembered because they chose not to run. And in that choice, across the sweep of centuries, people in every language and every nation have seen a piece of themselves. Thermopylae endures, not as a place where history happened, but as a question still asked when all is lost and the enemy surrounds you. Will you still stand?